Everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our screening and discussion of the Peabody Award-winning film, My Neighborhood, with Just Vision's Executive Director, Suhad Babaa. My name is David Kadaba. I'm on the Telos team, and I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C. this afternoon on the East Coast. For those of you who are joining us at a Telos event for the first time, the Telos Group is an American-based nonprofit whose mission is to form communities of American peacemakers across lines of difference and equip them to help reconcile seemingly intractable conflict at home and abroad. We're so excited for today's conversation and discussion. We're honored to have Suhad with us today, whom some of you may recognize from previous screenings we've done with Just Vision. In a minute, I'll introduce Suhad, who will give a brief introduction to the film, as well as explain how the screening will work. But first, I want to invite all of you to introduce yourself in the chat, as well as where you are joining us from. We will have a dedicated time for Q&A after the screening and a short time of moderated discussion between myself and Suhad. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat or send them to my colleague, Sarah Strub, who will be the host for this call. We will do our best to get to all of your questions in the time allotted, and I would encourage you to ask many questions. Suhad is an expert and brilliant speaker, so take full advantage of this opportunity to be in dialogue with her. With that, I'd like to introduce Suhad. Suhad Babaa is a media strategist, producer, human rights advocate, and the executive director of Just Vision, an organization that fills a media gap on Israel-Palestine through independent storytelling and strategic audience engagement. Suhad leads Just Vision's journalistic efforts as the co-director of the award-winning Hebrew language news site Local Call, and executive produced their feature-length documentary, Naila and the Uprising, which we screened last year. Suhad has addressed dozens of audiences at venues, including the United Nations and the White House, and her team's work has been featured by institutions including TED and highlighted in outlets including the New York Times, PBS, BBC, and more. Suhad, thank you for being here with us today, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, David, and always a big appreciation to the Telos community and team for having our team at Just Vision once again. It's a space that we have deeply cherished, and we thank each of you for making time to be with us in a conversation that I think is both ongoing and extremely urgent. And so I really deeply appreciate being with you. As way of background, my team at Just Vision is a group of journalists, storytellers, and human rights advocates. And for now, the past 17 years, we've dedicated our work to documenting, researching, and disseminating the stories of Israeli and Palestinian grassroots leaders who are striving to build a future of equality, justice, and freedom for all in the region. The story that we're about to watch, My Neighborhood, is a story that we began documenting back in 2008, 2009. As a little bit of background there, our first offices were a Palestinian, Israeli, and American team. Our first offices were located in the Palestinian East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. And so we are intimately familiar with what has taken place in that neighborhood. We've witnessed how it's been transformed as Israeli settlers who have been backed by Israeli courts and police have taken over the community. And when the community received their first wave of eviction orders in 2008 to 2009, we knew that this was an incredibly important story to tell for a couple of reasons. One, the sheer human impact on Palestinians who would be displaced from their homes was of significance and consequence that we knew was tied deeply to what is happening in the broader picture of Israel-Palestine. But two, we also knew that Jerusalem, which is a home for communities around the globe who have faith traditions, Christian, Muslim, Jewish communities, as well as is a flashpoint for both Israelis and Palestinians, that what happens in Jerusalem has significant consequences that can reverberate across Israel, Palestine, and certainly across the region. And so we began to document the story of My Neighborhood. The film you're about to watch was launched in 2012. It was followed by a 3-year outreach and education campaign in the United States and in Israel, Palestine. That campaign continues on today, with screenings being revived across the country here in the United States and across Israel, Palestine in the wake of recent events. What we'll do today is we're going to watch the film. It's 25 minutes, and then David and I are going to come back and we will dive into a conversation that is largely guided by your curiosities. So I look forward to that. We will see you in 25 minutes, and thank you again for being with us.
Thank you to those who stayed with us, and welcome back. Just a reminder, in a minute, we're going to have a short time of moderated discussion between Suhad and myself, but soon following after that, we're going to open up time for questions and answers. So just a reminder to put your questions in the chat, and we will call on you to ask your questions directly to Suhad if you'd like, or you can send them to the host of this call, Sarah Sturm, in which she can ask the question, and we can ask the question for you. But when to dive in, Suhad, this film is so powerful and impacts so much in such little time. And I love how we get to see and meet and get to know Mohammed through this film. And I'm inspired by his resiliency and hope. And at the same time, we're meeting him in this incredibly difficult time in his life. The film ends with this question of his family and their ability to stay in their home still unresolved. So what's the current status of Mohammed and his family today?
Thanks, David. Unfortunately, the status of Mohammed's family continues to get worse by the day. In October of 2020, several families in Sheikh Jarrah received eviction orders. Mohammed's family is one of them. Those eviction orders have been delayed due to court appeals and attempts by the community to challenge the court rulings. But what we know is that the courts have oftentimes in Israel, Palestine been set up to displace Palestinian residents. So at this point, it's really understood as a delay tactic by the residents, and they're not sadly hopeful about being able to stay in their homes. However, many of you are probably familiar with recent developments where the community is also saying we are going to try to resist by all means necessary to stay in our homes. And that looks like, visuals during the month of Ramadan. It's a Muslim community where they would break the fast in the middle of the streets. They actually were not leaving their homes to go get food and groceries for Ramadan. People were delivering that food to them, knowing that the minute that they leave their homes, the likelihood of settlers going into their homes and just taking them over by force, as you've seen, is actually quite high. So that is the lived reality of Mohammed and his family and the several other families. There are now 24 families. There was originally 28 families in the section of Sheikh Jarrah that we're concerned with that you see in the film. So this is an ongoing struggle that the community is facing and campaigning on with the hopes that they're able to push back and that the international courts or international community will intervene.
So I'm curious, we're seeing this happening to the El Kurd family and other families in Sheikh Jarrah, but is it abnormal? Is this an extreme story of dispossession, or is it common and happening elsewhere?
I wish we can say that it's abnormal and unique. It's not. This is happening across East Jerusalem. It's been happening across Israel, Palestine. So you have the community just up the road from Sheikh Jarrah, Wadi Joz, that is facing a different kind of displacement. Communities, you likely have heard entire, dozens and dozens of families being displaced in places like Silwan in East Jerusalem, in Nabi Saleh, in places like South Hebron Hills in the West Bank. You're seeing communities being demolished overnight, over and over again. And unfortunately, you're also seeing Palestinian communities within Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are increasingly finding themselves being the target of right-wing hate attempts and attacks on the community, oftentimes supported by the police and settlers. And so this is something that is systematic, and sadly, it looks different for every family. You know, when you get into the weeds of the legal cases and the kind of the tactics that are being used, it may look different, but the bigger picture, when you look at the forest, not the trees, is that this is systematic and ongoing.
And if folks are following events happening in Israel-Palestine, they may have seen that the escalation that happened in May with headlines of violence at Al-Aqsa Mosque and airstrikes and rockets from Gaza, that some of this was connected to what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah. So can you just explain what's the connection of what's happening with these families and these neighborhoods to the larger picture of what we saw in May?
Absolutely. So the center of events was actually Sheikh Jarrah. The community began campaigning again starting in October of 2020 when the latest round of eviction orders were issued. I know that they were campaigning because several of them turned to us to ask us if we can help in reactivating the networks that we built during the campaign around My Neighborhood, the film that you just saw. That campaign started to gain international and local traction. Where you had, you know, I'm not a big fan of hashtag movements, but you could really see kind of the conversation swell in social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, on other platforms, on Instagram, and folks who started to speak out that you traditionally didn't see speaking out on this issue. You know, you had icons like Viola Davis speaking out, and then you had congressional leaders, all of the folks that you have seen speaking out on this issue, like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and AOC, but you also had folks like Klobuchar and folks that hadn't historically kind of taken the positions that they did start to speak out. Locally, you also had a groundswell. So Palestinians from across the West Bank, across Israel, across East Jerusalem, were all standing in solidarity with what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah. And you may have heard that, you know, there were several Palestinians who were referring to it as an ongoing Nakba in Sheikh Jarrah. It became a symbol for ongoing forced displacement of Palestinians across the region. And because of that symbolic nature, people started to unify around it. It was during the month of Ramadan. You had folks who were coming in from places like Haifa in northern Israel in buses and by cars to stand in solidarity with Sheikh Jarrah and with the community. It got to the point where you had the Israeli military and police forces being so concerned that they were not allowing Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship, mind you. Okay, so they should technically be able to move where they want to move. They were not allowed into Jerusalem. And they were so committed to standing with the community that they literally parked their buses on the middle of the highway, got out of the buses and walked to Jerusalem. Some of them walked for over 4 hours. That's an incredible show of support. That's a people that's really determined not to let others within their community get displaced. So with that kind of support, both internationally and locally, it wasn't a surprise to us that the next thing that happened was that the Israeli military ransacked and attacked Al-Aqsa, which is one of the most sensitive faith-based sites for Palestinian Muslims and Muslims across the Middle East. And from there, you saw an escalation continue, right? And that's where things started to kind of continue to evolve over the course of May. Now, one of the things that is really important, you know, and I think this is what we were paying attention to, you had, I think the interesting thing about developments in May, you had the community in Sheikh Jarrah just playing an incredible role. So you saw Mohammed El Kurd, who you met in the film at 11 years old. He's now a 23-year-old powerhouse, organizing the community together with, and I need to say this because it's very important, he has a twin sister named Muna El Kurd. She's a force of nature. You didn't see her in the film, but she's a force of nature. The two of them, along with other Palestinian youth in Sheikh Jarrah, they were key in organizing a lot of what you were seeing in the international space, as well as locally. They were on television, MSNBC, John Oliver, CNN, really kind of putting their cause on the map, and making sure that there was momentum and that the narrative around this was being made very clear. Now, I think that the other thing that you were seeing, those are all very positive. The other thing that you are seeing, though, is what we typically see on this issue area. When the Israeli military attacks a place like Al-Aqsa, you'll see Hamas rockets. And that's quickly what the story became for some journalists and media outlets, that it started with the Hamas rockets, right? One of the things that I think was really interesting, though, and this was, I was closely monitoring several different news outlets. The New York Times at some point, Nick Kristof of the New York Times writes a piece about the role of US tax dollars in Israel-Palestine. And in rare occasion, there were comments in the comment box. And someone says, well, Nick, you missed the Hamas rockets. The story started with the Hamas rockets. He actually pushed back and he said, no, it actually started with a tiny neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah. And that's an amazing shift to hold on to, right? And where we start the story, where we actually, when we think about what is happening in Israel-Palestine, it actually matters to tell a fuller picture of what's happening and not fall into the tit for tat, which is so often the way in which the story is presented. And that's exactly what we were trying to do with My Neighborhood, is how, when you actually tell the story holistically of what these policies look like, who's behind them and driving them, and then what it looks like for real, live, actual people, it's no longer about 100,000 foot political vitriol, right? Which is what we usually get on this. It's actually policies that are constructed and designed intentionally and that have consequences on real people. And when we look at it at that level, it becomes really clear that there's something that we can do about it. This isn't something that's intractable or never ending. This is human made and can be resolved if we actually have the political will to do it.
Oh, I love that point, and I want to return to that later on in this conversation about some tangible action steps that we can do for those of us who are on the call, who might be Americans who are, engaging with this film, how we can follow up watching it so we don't just stop at the awareness piece. But I want to go back real quick to something you said, and then we'll open up to questions and answers in a minute here, but just about the importance of seeing behind the headlines, because so often there are these underlying factors that contribute to these things. And if we don't have the eyes to see it, we're going to miss them. And all we're going to get stuck on is the headlines of back and forth, the tit for tat violence. So I'm curious, how can we learn to see what's behind those headlines? What are some practices we can do so we can see the deeper issues, the structural issues even that are behind the violence that contribute to it in the first place?
Well, I think, one of the first thing is, I think as media consumers, it's coming in with an analytical eye and recognizing that mainstream media, whether it's because of commercial interests or because of political calculations, or because of a lack of knowledge and know-how, which in some cases that's also what it is, tends to provide a view of most issues, like whether it's Israel-Palestine, but also it's true of what's happening here in the United States, in the form of a snapshot. And that snapshot typically is seen as worthwhile capturing when there's some sensationalized headline to attach to it. And that looks like, in the case of Israel-Palestine, either top-down political failures and scandal or violence. And that tells you a very limited view. It gives you a really limited view of what's actually happening. So I think the first thing that I would say is, knowing that those are trends, is to ask yourself, okay, well, what else is this not telling me? And the second thing I think that's really useful is finding alternative sources for information beyond the mainstream. One of the mainstream media outlets, that are credible and accurate is really important, because there's a lot of misinformation. So being really aware of that floating around as well is important. I think is finding the journalists who are on the ground, who are telling the stories and following stories over time is really important. Finding media outlets that are independent and accurate. So we have the good fortune of partnering with a team called 972 Magazine. They provide English language news coverage. They are on the ground. They're Palestinian and Israeli journalists who are oftentimes telling the story from the ground up. We also partner with them on a local call, which is our Hebrew language news site. We actually produce for the Israeli public to be hearing direct and unfiltered perspectives that they would otherwise not be hearing in the mainstream media. So those are just, a couple of sources if you're interested. I often talk about 972 Mag provides in-depth kind of feature analysis and commentary on what's happening. So you won't get breaking news, but you'll have depth in that space. And I also think about, review multiple sources of information. That's always really important. I find myself consuming certainly those outlets that I tend to align with more often, but I also really find it helpful to be looking at outlets that and reading outlets that don't necessarily represent, what I hope would be covered on Israel-Palestine. So that certainly looks like at times, Ynet News or the Jerusalem Post, which doesn't always have great coverage of Israel-Palestine, but it's really helpful to understand how are the narratives being constructed and what are the differing ways in which news is being presented. The last thing that I'll say is, as media consumers, we have a huge role, and to play in terms of what the mainstream media covers and doesn't cover. I won't ever forget, there was many years ago in Nabi Saleh, there was a women's contingent, a group of Palestinian women activists who came together from all over the West Bank and Israel. It was quite extraordinary. You had people from Haifa and Nazareth coming into Nabi Saleh for what would have been one of the first women's actions to reach the spring in the community. The community has been cut off from water access. And they all gathered. They got to the spring. It was like this incredible moment. And you had journalists. We had journalists there from CNN and from, the kind of top correspondents in the region. And they all started to pack up and were, packing up their cars. And when we asked them why they were packing up their cars, they said, look, there was no action here today. And we're like, you mean there was no military violence? And they said, yeah, there was no military violence. There's nothing to cover. Mm. Right. And I think those, just knowing that that's the kind of, that's the kind of coverage that outlets oftentimes are looking for when we have a role to play. And, one, letting them know when we want to see better coverage, and also letting them know when they're covering things well. I think that's also incredibly important. And the journalists specifically who are going out of their way to be courageous, I think hearing from people about appreciation for context and nuance is really important, because the level of self-censorship that journalists put themselves through, the number of journalists I've talked with who have said to me, look, I think this is really important, but I won't cover it because every time I do, it's like months and months of me having to deal with vitriol from like the public, or like dealing with my bosses who are upset with me that I rock the boat. That's a very real thing.
Yeah, that's such a great point about the agency that we have as consumers to support those journalists who are reporting honestly and accurate about these things, and just an encouragement to everyone to send encouragement, to send just thankfulness to those reporters who are doing that work. And it reminds me of this question of when we're seeing violence, we also have to ask what violence we're not seeing, right? And one of the practices of peacemaking that we hold to is to center the leadership of the marginalized, which recognizes that the people closest, most adjacent to a problem often have the best solutions for that problem. And when we're talking about these tricky issues and things happening in Israel-Palestine, when you see these headlines, one of the best things you can do, as you say, is to go to the people who are actually on the ground, who are living and experiencing these issues firsthand. And one great thing about our era is that with social media, you can hear directly from these folks. Mohammed has a Twitter account with, I think, probably over 1 million followers at this point, and I encourage folks to find him and listen to him and follow him and hear directly from him and others who are on the ground. I mean, it's so important. I want to transition now to a time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, again, feel free to add them to the chat or send them to our host, Sarah Sturm, and we can ask them directly for you. But I want to invite first Nathan, if you're still on the call with us, if you would like to unmute and ask your question.
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Yeah,
Yes.
you kind of already answered it, but I was wondering if he talked about becoming a human rights lawyer or a journalist. So I guess he's got a Twitter following. But is he in school? Is he?
Yeah, so Mohammed and I are quite close. He's someone who I think several people on our team, we became very close with him. So he ended up going to Savannah, the Savannah College of Art and Design. He made a hard left. So as opposed to becoming a human rights lawyer, he decided that he wanted to become a poet. And you actually hear glimmers of it in My Neighborhood. He was writing poetry from when he was very, very young. He's a brilliant writer today. He teaches, he's actually in a master's program. He also teaches kids poetry. He moved back to Sheikh Jarrah. So I should say he was he was at the Savannah College of Art and Design. He ended up heading up to New York, where he had been living prior to moving back to Sheikh Jarrah, given everything that's been going on. He'll likely be back in the US to finish up his program in the coming months, is what he hopes. In terms of kind of where he is now, I think I think this is something that a lot of young Palestinians, I think, wrestle with. Both the commitment to being and understanding that there's a very important role to play. He's one of the only folks in the community that has strong enough English to be an international ambassador and spokesperson for the community. That comes with immense responsibility. And so he's, in addition to trying to finish up school and trying to support his family that's dealing with this incredibly traumatic and ongoing stressor, he's also one of the front faces, the public faces of what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah. So he has multiple responsibilities at this point.
Thank you.
Of course, Nathan.
I have a question from an anonymous participant, so I'll read it out for us. This person says, are there Christian organizations that are doing anything to help? Can you address different needs? How can people help with relief, supplies, and advocacy? And I think this is a really important question, just recognizing the way that Christian communities in the US have been involved in what's happening in Israel Palestine for a very long time and have a strong influence on the events in the day-to-day lives of both Israelis and Palestinians. So I think it's a really interesting question. Are there Christian organizations, and more broadly, how can these folks help?
Yeah, absolutely. There certainly are Christian organizations, both in the states that are in solidarity to Israel, Palestine, and Palestinians who are seeking out rights and justice. There are also organizations locally. I'm happy to connect with you to provide that, those organizations. One of the things that I think is really important to also hold is that while there are faith-based organizations and communities in the region that are working on this issue, by and large, Palestinians do not view this as a religious war or a religious issue, right? Palestinians are diverse, Muslim, Christian, agnostic, so on and so forth. And they see this as deeply tied to an ethno-religious privilege that's been imposed on the ground. And so I think, finding those faith-based communities that are able to both hold their faith and understand it as a positive tool in a space where faith has become weaponized, I think is an incredibly important way to contribute to this. I want to actually turn this over to you, David, because I think you and the Telos team have been working very, very closely with a number of Christian organizations, both in the region and here in the States. Are there any that you want to point out for this audience?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a number of organizations that I can think of, including Churches for Middle East Peace and Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East, and a few others, which we can include in a post-event email. But just as far as Telos is concerned, we consider ourselves a multi-faith, multi-partisan movement, but we work really closely with lots of Christian communities, and we see the opportunity there for Christians to support a future of mutual flourishing in Israel and Palestine. And inviting Christian communities into a new way of discipleship, a discipleship of peacemaking. So for those who are Christians on the call, one of the most famous sermons ever given was the Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." And we think that that's just an important calling for Christians to actually not just be peacekeepers or peace prayers, but to actually be peacemakers, that we are invited as Christians into a new life which seeks to reconcile and to create justice, and recognizing that the Christian vision for peace is actually shalom, or restoration, or healing. And so we believe, and we recognize that there's a history there of the weaponization of faith, and how in different ways Christian communities across time have unfortunately exacerbated the issues and created and supported injustices, but that there's also an opportunity for Christian communities to really live into what they're called to be, and to support a future for both peoples. And we're creating some programming now, in fact, a future podcast on weaponizing faith. And so I'd encourage everyone, if that's something you're interested in, to stay tuned and subscribe to our podcast channel, the Telos channel. And we'll be reporting and having conversations on how has faith been weaponized in the past to support violence, but then also how can it be used to create communities that create just futures in places of conflict.
Thanks, David. And I'll just get to the second part of the question, just to add on around what can we do in this space. I think that there's a few different things that I just want to put into the room. One is, while there has been progress in the narrative around this issue, and specifically, I think we saw a groundswell of support and the narrative changing pretty rapidly over the May-June period. That's what's important to note about that, is that was, in my view, built on decades and decades of work. People who were in the trenches, talking to their friends, talking to their families, talking to the representatives, talking to the community, their educators, right, about this issue, organizing around the globe, that really built us to the moment where we were ready. And by we, I mean a collective we, everyone on this call, and the many, many, many people that we are not represented here. To keep going, we need to continue to move on this narrative and move on how people talk about this issue and what's at stake and whose lives are impacted. And in that, there's a very easy, on one hand, a very easy, but probably one of the most heavy lifts. And all I'm asking you to do is to speak about this within your communities publicly. I'm going to say the reason that I say that this is, on one hand, very easy, but probably the most difficult, the number of people over the years that I've met who say to me, Suhad, I believe in equal rights for all in Israel, Palestine. I believe that every human being deserves dignity and freedom. But the minute we walk away from this table, I can't say that in the public space. I've heard that a lot. The ability for this conflict and for this inequity to continue on rests in silence. It thrives in silence. So when each person here talks about this issue with their communities, with their friends, with their families, it makes a big difference. It breaks through the silence. To do that, use films like My Neighborhood to host a screening in your community. It might look like just watching it with your family over dinner and having a conversation. That might be the place to start. And then at your community center, and then within your church, your mosque, your synagogue, and then within your kids' classrooms. And you keep going. If you know journalists, ask them if they're covering this issue. Ask them if they're paying attention to it. Give them a copy of this film. Make sure that they're aware of it so that they have an educational touch point the next time anything they're talking about or covering intersects with this, so that they have context. If you're in touch with congressional leaders or local leadership, make sure that they know what this story is about. The number of people that I've talked to of influence who are like, wait, but isn't this a real estate dispute? This is not a real estate dispute. I think you all have seen that this is not a real estate dispute. And my response to that is not actually getting in a debate or a back and forth. I give them this film and I say, why don't you watch this and then we'll have a conversation about it. Take 25 minutes. So that's these are my, some of the calls to action that I encourage us to think about. I think for those who are ready to start thinking about, how do we actually talk about accountability of the Israeli government and of political leaders who are perpetuating human rights abuses. We should be thinking about the role of, our pocketbooks, the role of our tax dollars, the role of US policy on this issue. One of the things that has been so disheartening and hard to on one hand, it's disheartening. It's one of the big challenges on this issue, but when you have a challenge, you also know you have an opportunity, and a massive one is as everything has been unfolding in Israel-Palestine, the country that the Israeli government depends upon to protect it is the US. The US blocked at the Security Council at the UN issuing a statement condemning the acts of violence by the Israeli military and police. That's astounding. That's astounding. If we're able to move policy here in the United States and move the narrative here in the United States, there's a big potential to unblock a lot of the behaviors that we're seeing in the region. So those are just, a few thoughts on that. And again, if folks are interested in talking more about it, ways that you can get involved and really thinking about, where are you at and what are the spheres of influence that you have? I think each person has certain access and influence, and thinking about how you can pull on your community and your networks is always a really valuable exercise that I'd love to do with you if it's useful.
Those are such great examples of ways that we can get involved and respond to watching a film like this, Suhad. So thank you for those. And I'm just struck by the ways also in which that we all have so much agency, especially for those who are American citizens. As you said, the US has such an outsized role in what's happening in Israel-Palestine. And so I just think of one of the practices of peacemaking that as part of our principles and practice of peacemaking at Telos is to own your agency and responsibility, to recognize that, yeah, as an American, in some way, even if I don't realize it, I am involved. Even if I've never, actively wrote my senator about this or said, shared something on Facebook or whatever, I'm involved in what's going on and I'm responsible for it in some way. But at the same time, like you said, we have this massive opportunity to take hold of that responsibility and turn it into a new future, turn it into actively contributing to a just resolution and transformation of this violence into peace and justice. And so I love all those suggestions, and we will be sure to include those in our post-event email so everyone can have those. I want to share another question sent to us anonymously, and it's that several news outlets announced that Israeli Prime Minister Bennett won't order evictions in Sheikh Jarrah if the court allows it. So the question is, are there important implications of this move in other areas of Israel, or what's your take on that announcement?
Gosh, this gets into kind of the analysis that's analysis piece. So let me take a step back. So back in May, the courts were supposed to rule on the status, the High Court of Israel, which is the Supreme Court in Israel, was supposed to rule on the status of the eviction orders of the El Kurd family and several others. It would have been the final ruling. Now, what they did is they said, actually, to both the settlers and to the residents of Sheikh Jarrah, the Palestinian residents, why don't you guys come up with a compromise and come back to us? And the settlers, of course, didn't want to compromise with the Palestinians, and the Palestinians who own their homes, who have been displaced for a second time, certainly didn't want to compromise with the Israeli settlers. Now, what ended up happening after that, you had the kind of wave of protests in international condemnation of evicting Palestinians from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah, and the Israeli courts kicking the can down the road. So they said that they would hear the case later down the line. At some point, the Attorney General of Israel issued a statement during the height of the kind of international attention on this issue, saying that he's going to review the case files. Now, why is that important? It's important because it potentially signaled at that moment that this was being considered as an issue of national importance by the Israeli government. The Attorney General came back and actually said, after reviewing the case files, he doesn't see any space for him making a different opinion than the courts would on this. And this is a legal matter. It is out of the hands of the state. It is a legal matter in the hands of the courts. Why do I give you this background? This is like, you know, a government that's trying to kind of shed accountability. They're trying to say, basically, this is a legal matter. The courts are going to deal with it. And what the courts rule is going to be legally binding because this is all lawful, right? That's basically, so when you hear this kind of the news breaking about Bennett, we don't get super excited about it because we see the chessboard that's being played out right now. The courts are set to hear the case. The High Court is set to hear the case on August 2nd. We'll see what happens. There's two likely scenarios. Either the High Court is going to kick it down the road again, or they're going to rule likely against the Palestinian residents. Those are the two likely scenarios at this point. What Bennett's statement also means is that if the court rules to evict the Palestinians, there's going to be no intervention, right? That's the other piece that comes out of that. So I think you know, you're hearing a very pessimistic view of what's taking place. The thing that I want to hold us all to and like drive our attention to, you know, I think about the Jim Crow laws in the United States. Simply because something is a law that's backed by a court system, with an administration or a government willing to turn a blind eye to the court system because in fact they're in on it too, doesn't make something just or right. And I think we've seen it here in the States before. We've seen it all over the globe. We're seeing it in Israel-Palestine right now. The silver lining of it is that we know that this happened before. What's happening in Israel-Palestine is not unique. Again, we can do something about it. This isn't so complicated that we haven't seen it before and we don't know what to do with it. We actually do, right? That's the silver lining of it. The difficult piece of it is that it's incredibly infuriating and very sad to see whenever a community or population is being treated this unfairly and unjustly and unequally, simply based on their identity.
Yeah. It's an important reminder of the urgency of this family situation, but also of urgency of responding to this film. And whenever we're engaging with what's happening in Israel Palestine and learning more, to not let it end there, right? To not let the awareness move us into silence, but actually move us into action. And just a follow-up question, which I thought was really great from Ken, if you'd like to unmute on this question of, you know, what is our agency? What can we do in reality? But Ken, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, thanks a lot. So my question is about how sensitive the Israeli government actually is to this international pressure and what can we actually do? Because I think it's important to acknowledge, you know, the element of, you know, you said people should stand up and talk. Well, I've been working for 20 years with refugees in the Netherlands. I'm in the Netherlands and I've been fired twice. I've had my research blocked for standing up and talking, which means that not many governmental agencies actually want to work with me. And so I'm planning on going to Israel to work with a Palestinian Christian priest in Nazareth as soon as the borders open. And so I just want to acknowledge that there's, you know, real anxiety about if we speak up, but we do want to go to Israel. Will I be stopped at the border? You know, how far as well is the reach of the Israeli government? So this, you know, it's a two-pronged question, just to acknowledge that there are potential risks. I mean, it hasn't stopped me so far, but I haven't been doing activist work in Israel yet, but I do have a lot of contacts there.
Kim, first and foremost, just a huge appreciation to you. Thank you for everything that you've done, and that I know that you'll continue to do in the face of, you know, tremendous odds. Second, absolutely important to recognize and acknowledge the risks involved. There are many, and we've seen, unfortunately, a lot of people, you know, having their careers put on the line or facing retribution in various ways. I'm trying to provide some, a little bit of real talk here. So forgive me that I'm not going to be super hopeful or inspirational. I think we've actually passed the point of trying to do that. And we need to start thinking about the deep consequences of not speaking up. Here in the United States, there are 33 states that have passed something called the anti-boycott laws vis-a-vis Israel. Those laws have caused contractors of the state to be fired from their jobs, for newsrooms to not get paid for their contracts, and for lawyers who represent inmates in public prisons to not get paid for more than a year for not signing a pledge that they don't engage in boycotts of the state of Israel. The last time we saw something like that was McCarthy era. It is tremendously concerning that that here in the United States, not only are we being, not only has there been a pattern and practice where people have been alienated for speaking up for their views on this issue, this is now codified in law. Something only gets codified in law, and my belief is that laws oftentimes only represent where a society is at a given moment in time. Laws can only be codified if people don't speak up, if social norms are a certain way that support that. And I think that's one of the things that's deeply concerning about what's happening. When we don't speak up, there are legislators, there are interests involved that will keep moving to continue to seal off and calcify this so that no one can speak up. And so that it scares people. The bigger thing than losing your job or not getting paid for a contract is that it's a chilling effect. It's meant to say to everyone around those people, if you say something, this is going to be you next. Where does it stop? Is my question. I mean, I've been following this issue now for my entire life. I'm Palestinian and Korean, just for transparency. So, I grew up with this in my households. I'm no stranger to it. Initially, it was a concern about Palestinians who face administrative detention, nonviolent leaders who get rounded up and tortured for organizing their community nonviolently, right? Then it was about Israeli activists who were considered radicals or anarchists getting visits by the Shin Bet, and laws being passed in Israel that say that Jewish Israelis aren't allowed to boycott Israeli companies that are upholding occupation. Now it's, in US soil and European soil. I think there's a big question, a real deep ethical and strategic question for us to ask about where do we let this continue to go? Now, it's not just Israel-Palestine, right? The thing is that this is kind of like a gateway for a lot of different things. One of the reasons that, I've been so concerned about the anti-boycott laws, I've been so concerned about the encroaching attempts to silence dissent on this issue, to silence critique of Israeli policy, whether in the region or here, is because it often bleeds out onto other issues and other communities. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We've seen several states that have passed laws to punish companies that choose to divest from fossil fuels, for example. Or more recently in the last month, states that have decided to punish companies that choose not to do business with certain firearms organizations. I think it's pretty astounding that this is what is happening. And so, I think the piece here, just Kim, to share, I think is when we don't speak up, there are consequences as well. And they don't stop. And that's part of, again, this isn't a hopeful, inspirational, kind of raw, but I do think this is a moment of urgency. We're seeing this move very fast in negative ways, but we do have power to stop it. And, when you see something like what just happened with Ben & Jerry's, they decided to stop selling ice cream in the Israeli settlements. They're trying to just stick to international law. And you see the Israeli government behave the way that they are. They're calling on US lawmakers to punish the company here on US soil. They're threatening to go after their investments and their stocks and have the stock crash, right? When you see that kind of behavior from the Israeli government, it tells you a couple of things. It tells you, one, when people speak up and stand up for something, it scares them. And two, there's actually power behind it. Right. And so, that's where my hope comes from. It comes from the place that I know every time someone speaks up, there is power behind it. And the more of us that are courageous and that speak up in unison, the more difficult it is for them to kind of, for those in power to wield harm, and knowing that it's not just about us anymore. It's about a lot of communities. It's not just about Israel, Palestine. It's about an ethos and a society that we're trying to create. What are the values of the society that we want to create? What are the values we want to pass down to our kids? Our kids are going to be the ones that have to live with this, right? And so just thinking about that, all of those factors is what motivates me. And Kim, thank you for again, all of the ways that you've shown up. And I know that there's a lot of people on this call who have taken great risks to do the work that they do. And there's peacemaking, and I'm using the language of Telos, peacemaking is an act of courage.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer, Suhad, and thanks to all who stayed with us. We're closing just a minute, but this, what you mentioned about this question of how far do we let things go, I'm reminded of one of the first laws of physics, right? Which is an object in motion will stay in motion unless exerted upon by a force. And so we see these injustices that have so much momentum that feel like they're just going to keep going on and rolling until they're pushed against by a force. And all of us who are watching this film, who are joining this call, we can be that force, right? When we have these conversations, when we go out into our communities and we speak up and we are no longer silent, we're pushing back against the momentum and we're charting a new path for our future. And so this question of what we can do in our own agency is so essential. And just to follow up on this point about the Israeli government's response to international pressure, we saw this past May, something really surprising and different from what we've seen in the past, in which after only about 10 days, we saw a ceasefire. The last time an escalation happened, it went on for much, much longer. And unfortunately, thousands more died. But this past May, the hostilities only lasted for 10 days. And as soon as Biden made an express call to the Israeli government, within 24 hours, a ceasefire was announced, right? And that happened because people were talking about it. They were raising their voices. They were amplifying the voices of those on the ground who are experiencing this firsthand. And we saw that make a difference in the lives of those on the ground. So just this question of is there opportunity, is there agency? I think the answer is yes, even as we wrestle with the frustration and the momentum of these injustices. Just a reminder that hope, as our friend Reverend Mitri Rahab says, hope is what we do, right? So it's not just this pie in the sky, airy optimism, it's actually how you respond. So that's an encouragement to you all at the end of this call. I just want to say thank you for joining us today, and a special thank you to Suhad and Kate and all those from Just Vision for joining us for this call and making such incredible movies as this. Again, please find more resources on their website, amplify their work. They're doing great stuff. For those who are interested, we are also currently recruiting for our second cohort of table hosts. These are our core volunteers who bring peacemaking to their communities. So learn more about that on our website or join our info session actually later today at 5 p.m. Eastern. And be sure to fill out the interest form for joining that cohort by August 1st. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you at a future Telos event.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone.